So Ruby is really great. Yeah, so I don't want this to be an I talk all the time talk, mostly because I didn't prepare, but also because I don't like doing that. I think it's like, especially something like Ruby, feel free to add in things you want to talk about, things in Ruby that I'm missing or things that Ruby is missing, and you want to speak up about it. Ruby is something C5 has a lot of experience with it. So people have a lot of opinions about it and things they hate, things they love, etc. Please just, I don't know, interrupt. I'm an interrupter, so I give everyone else the power to interrupt me because I would probably do it to you. So yeah, so this is the best Matt's quote about Ruby for sure. Ruby is dynamic like human nature. So let's talk about where Ruby came from. This guy, Yukihiro Matsumoto, aka Matt's, apparently super nice guy. I've never actually met him. I'm sure some of you probably have at conferences. I don't know not much about his person. I just know about his language. So Ruby has actually started to be produced in 1993, which is only about a few years after Python was released. The first public release was in 95. And he's actually pretty involved in Ruby development currently. He was a big part of the push to Ruby 3.0, and I think he still manages and directs and has opinions about the project. Yeah, and so where did Ruby come from? I would say the top two influences for sure are Smalltalk and Perl. Ruby seems kind of like a child of both of those in a lot of ways. Definitely like wispiness, not so much the syntax, but first-class functions or kind of first-class functions, closures, etc. And definitely Python. So Python is kind of the new kid on the block with higher level languages. It's a lot simpler than something like Perl. And Matt's actually said that he wanted to make an OO scripting language, and he felt like Python kind of felt like the OO was bolted on, and he wanted to kind of just include that from the beginning. Yeah, the Lisp thing is a little weird just because Ruby has pretty busy syntax, but you know, functions, maps, reduces, etc. So Ruby's kind of a pretty big language. It's interpreted, it's object-oriented. I would say it's very object-oriented. It's dynamically typed. I guess they are introducing type definition files now, but it's pretty much known as a dynamically typed language. It has really strong scripting language features. I'm thinking things like Bash, things like Perl. Functional programming inspired blocks and iterators. A big standard library, very, very big. And with that comes a very large method footprint for built-in objects. There's a method in Ruby called methods, and you can call it on objects. And if you call it on array, I think you'll get like probably 70 or 80 things. Yeah, Demos is making a face. Because yeah, Ruby, like if there's one criticism you can make, it's that every object has a bajillion methods on it. And things like active record don't change that. But even things like arrays and built-in hashes are pretty crazy. And breaking from Python, there's basically multiple ways of doing everything. There's lots of method aliasing. There are lots of pieces of syntax that look like other pieces of syntax, but work differently. There are different ways to write things, etc. So yeah, let's just talk about the Ruby basic data types. Right, so we have integers, we have floats, rationals. I don't think anyone really uses rationals, but they exist in the language. Booleans, your trues, your falses, strings, symbols, which are denoted by a colon. Those are kind of like internal strings. They're kind of stored in a table. They don't take up space or anything like that. And they're nice for human readable things that you don't want to modify or concatenate. Array syntax is very similar to most other languages. And these, like a lot of dynamic languages, have adjustable size. They aren't paired with a size like something like C. Hashes in Ruby, hashes with nearly arbitrary keys and values. So yeah, that's a lambda put in as the key of a hash. And then we have a symbol as a key of a hash and a string as a key of a hash. And then the values are all different too. Almost anything can be a hash key in Ruby. The only exceptions are things like arrays and things like hashes, because there's a method called .hash, and .hash for hashes and .hash for arrays depends on their contents. And so it's actually pretty easy to change the contents of a hash key if they're an array or hash, so don't use them for hash keys. Ruby also has a built-in regex syntax, very similar to Perl. It has, pretty much all the Perl gizmos in it. It also has options after the slash. Here, I is case insensitive. There's a whole bunch of them. I think the coolest one is X, which lets you put comments in your regex, which, if you need comments in your regex, it happens, but probably do something else. And then, of course, what would an OO language be like without the original sin of nil? We got to have nil. What's the point without nil? Yeah, so I was talking about how Ruby kind of has some built-in shell script features that I find useful. So backticks, if I put backticks around a shell command, it runs the command and outputs, takes the output and gives me a string back. It has the familiar from bash $?, which is the exit status of the last run command. It includes a .success ? Method. There is definitely a Rubyism where Boolean questions tend to have question marks at the end. It has the familiar argv from bash, which is an array of the CLI arguments, which is very useful for processing arguments or going through command line options. But you probably should do that with a library. And then there's one really cool thing that I don't think that many people know about called argf. And argf is amazing for shell scripts. Argf basically says you can do argf.read, and argf.read will either read standard in to a string, or if you give the script file names, it will concatenate and give you the text contents of those files. And it works with both file names or standard in. So actually quite similar to the command line utility cat, which can take standard in, or it can take command line argument file names. I think, oh no, that might, I don't know. I'm actually not sure about cat, but this is what argf does. I haven't used cat in a bit. And also it has very easy to use signal trapping, and you can call exit with status. Here, exit true is the same as exit 0. And then you can do exit more than 0 for failures. Kind of a weird place to put in, but true 0 is not true in Ruby, and it's also not false. Yeah, so let's get into object orientation, which I think is probably Ruby's strongest aspect. So Ruby, I described as like very object-oriented. I think it's like sort of more object-oriented than something like Java. Java kind of has the built-in types that aren't really objects, and then it has all these objects, and then it has object wrappers for built-in things that make them feel like objects. Ruby doesn't have that. Every object has methods in Ruby. So yeah, one.even ? That's a thing. It's false. You can ask nil if nil is nil, and nil is nil, so it returns true. You can get the class of things by doing .class. So true.class has a class called trueClass, of which there is only one instance, namely true. You can also get the class of a class. So true.class.class is class. And if you just keep adding classes, you keep getting the word class. So the class of class is class. And it's kind of fun to say that, and it's entertaining and great. Likewise, almost everything in Ruby is a method. So if we go to things that don't look like methods, they're actually methods. So if we start in the upper left, if we want to concatenate two arrays with plus, and we go to the right, that's actually calling the plus method on the left side and passing in the right-hand side. And so these are equivalent in Ruby. And so if you want to change how plus works with your object, you would redefine the dot plus operation. Same with index lookup. So if I look up the 0th index of an array, that's calling, oh, whoops, I forget a dot. There should be a dot between on the right, but that's calling the square brackets method with the argument 0. Likewise, the append operator, which is less than, is actually a method of the same name. Oh God, I'm screwing up my periods here. Hold on, I don't want to confuse anyone. Whatever, it's live coding. Okay, let's go back. Cool. So yeah, and actually property assignment on an object is actually a method called property equals. So everything's a method. Even things like puts and built-in things like that, they're methods in a module called kernel, and kernel is included by the ancestor of every object. So it's quite different. It's kind of neat. It means that you can kind of do operator overloading, but your operator overloading is actually just method redefinition. Inheritance, which everyone hates, but is part of Ruby for sure. It's definitely part of the built-in object hierarchy. And it's definitely, pretty straightforward. Right, so class, my class is a subclass. That's the less than of superclass. And if we have a method called go, and then we take some arguments, we can do puts, which prints out the string side effect, and then call super. Super without any arguments just passes the arguments that you got into super, which is a little weird. It's also a place where parentheses matter quite a bit in Ruby, because super with empty parentheses means don't pass any arguments. Super with parentheses or without parentheses means pass what was given to this method, and then call the superclass method. MIXINS. So Ruby has MIXINS, which people prefer to inheritance because it's shallower, it's composition over inheritance, etc. Ruby kind of uses MIXINS in some interesting ways. One of the most obvious ways is something called enumerable. So if I make a class called, in this case, myEachable, which is a stupid name, but it gets the point across. And if we define each, and each does something with a block and it iterates, we can include a module called enumerable. And enumerable takes this each and lets us call map, call reduce, call find, call a whole bunch of other things on that object, just by using the built-in each method that the object provides. And so enumerable is a very common module in a lot of Ruby stuff. Things like array, things like hash include enumerable. So a lot of the methods that you know and love exist on those objects. So this stuff's kind of boring, like it's pretty standard. This is where stuff gets weird in Ruby. So there's this thing called a meta class. A meta class is the class of a class. And we saw that if you call .class on a class, you get class. But Ruby has it a little more. So I would prefer not to use the word meta class because it's a little confusing in Ruby. I think something like EIGENCLASSES or singleton classes or singleton methods gets the point across better. The reason I say that is because in Ruby, you can do not weird stuff like define class methods on the meta class by using the word self inside a class definition, right? And so inside my class, self is referring to the thing inside. The scope in there is my class. And so you now made a method called myClass.config, and it returns a hash whose value is port, and then a key of port pointing to the number 1337. Right, so this is an example of meta class or eigenclass programming in Ruby that's very normal looking. What's up, Brian?
And you would just call that by calling my class with a capital, with a titleized case and .config. So
yes,
not on
yes.
an instance.
Yeah, so you can actually define this, instead of saying self.config, you could actually put my class.config in there. And you'll get a class level method, or what most other languages call a static method. But this is very Smalltalk inspired, where these methods are actually sort of like living on the classes class, instead of like this static declaration. So this is not weird. This is pretty standard. This feels very OO, feels great. Stuff gets weird though. So suppose I make a class called my class. And now since I don't have the word self, it's actually an instance method. So def server is an instance method that returns the string example.com. And I make an instance of that class called instance by using the new keyword. So my class.new, I get an instance back. I am allowed to redefine the method config on a single, oh, sorry, hold on. Told you I didn't spend that much time doing this. Oh, I'm just gonna live code this. Sorry, this is supposed to be server. Cool, all right. Everything makes sense. Okay, so I can actually redefine a method on an instance, and it only affects that instance. So every single other method, or every single other instance of my class will have a server of example.com. And this one instance will have a server of example.gov. This seems weird, and it is weird. I actually got to use this feature in code. It's very good for prototyping things. So I wanted to make a new class that was based off an old class, and I wasn't quite sure what to change. And so I made you make an instance, and then you can just tweak parts of the class, and then the rest of the class works like the other classes. So you can kind of figure out what you need to do. And I actually got to do this to figure out how to implement a new class just by kind of experimenting. So it is a useful thing. I don't think it's a good thing to do maybe in production code. It's a little confusing and it's a little weird, but yes, you can do this. So this is weird. This isn't that weird, but I wouldn't recommend it. And then you can do things that you definitely shouldn't do. So you can redefine the nil question mark method on the object nil to be false. And that's obviously stupid because nil is definitely nil. But this works. It actually breaks IRB if you try it. IRB gets really confused. And IRB will actually, I think, throw an exception as soon as you enter it, because it uses nil checks to determine what to do. And
what is the exception it throws if you do this? Please stop.
I mean, let's do it.
Please
I'm
stop
down.
Exception.
Oh my God, don't.
Do not pass go exception.
All right. All right, so let's fire up IRB. I forget what it does. It's pretty good though. Okay, so def nil dot nil question mark false. False. Yeah, so it's just like, I don't know what this is. But
resource temporarily unavailable. I love it.
I don't know if you're talking slow or your computer's being weird or both, but it's
Yeah,
a good effect,
super
Gabby.
like
So.
that.
Very apt
No.
for the situation.
Yeah. Somebody made this mistake in Zoom code and that's what's happening. But yes, so you can do stuff like this. You probably shouldn't do stuff like this. But yeah, since nil is an instance, you can change stuff on it. It gets a little weird though, because you can't do things like one dot plus number. I think this is just the syntax error. Just make it return 7 no matter what. Yeah, like it doesn't even, it's confused. That's the syntax error. I don't know how, okay, there we go. Oh. All right, so let's get back to the talk. And thank you, Gabby, for that. That's exactly what I want to do, is I want to open IRB and show you wacky shit. Okay, so the other weird property of Ruby is, like the maths quote, it's dynamic. Ruby pretty much has full dynamic dispatch. What that means is that method definitions are looked up at runtime when you do stuff. So let's get a simple code example. So start on the left and we'll go over to the right. Oh, damn it. I keep doing I'd had it server before. Sorry, I'm gonna modify this, ignore, just like twiddle your thumbs, look away, check Twitter, whatever you all do. Okay, cool. All right. So we make a class called myClass, and we define an instance method server that's example.com. So it just returns a string example.com. And then we make an instance of this class called myClass.new. And we say instance.server, and we get back the expected myexample.com. If in the same context, we reopen the class myClass. Oh, whoops. Oh, God. I'm terrible at this. I didn't spell check. All right, let's go back. All right. So if we reopen the class myClass and redefine server to be example.gov, then the instance that we already defined gets that new definition and it returns example.gov. So you can change class evaluation at runtime. It also means that you could open up existing classes and change their definitions and add stuff to them. The word for that is called monkey patching, and the general consensus is don't do that. You can do it if you're Rails, which means you have sway and you can kind of dictate things. But for most projects, you ought not do it. Yeah, so I was talking about something called blocks. Blocks are kind of a unique feature of Ruby. They're not quite first-class functions, but they are useful and they show up a lot. So starting in the upper left, we have an array of letters, and we have map, right? Map does what map does everywhere, which is take each element of the array and then take the function that's passed to it and evaluate it for each element and then give you back the array with the original elements replaced with the results of the block called on each element. Right, so this is what an anonymous function in big quotes looks like in Ruby. So you'll see do, and then you have vertical bars. Vertical bars define the argument to the anonymous function. And so I'm going to call it letter because they're letters. And yeah, we call letter dot uppercase, right? And that will uppercase the letter. So the results of this will be just an array with capital A, capital B, capital C. Right? And then talking about how Ruby has multiple ways of doing things. There's a more compact syntax using curly braces. So you can use curly braces in place of do end, and you get the same thing. What's up, Brian?
Some behavior difference?
There is.
Another language. Okay, cool.
No, there is. So they mean the same thing, but they have different precedents. So we should be able to do that, right? I like live coding, so I'm going to live code. So let's do def A. And what we'll do is if block given, right? Let's block given to A yield. Right, so I made a method called A. And this basically says if A gets a block given to it, we're going to perform the side effect of printing block given to A to the console, and then we're going to call the block. And let's make a method called B. If block given, let's block given to B. Yield, same thing. So it calls it, but it puts a different string. Right, and so, oh, hold on. I think we have to modify it. Sorry, I think we have to be a little gentler. So we're gonna give it arbitrary arguments. And I think that is required. I don't think it matters, but okay. All right, so we have a method called A that when it gets a block, it produces the fact that it got a block and calls the block. And B, which does the same thing, but prints out block given to B, right? And so I think if we do this, right, then I believe B gets the block here, right? Given block to B, I'm a block B. And if we do end, I believe A gets the block. So yeah, so they have slightly different precedents, which is the only place this ever shows up in my experience is RSpec. If you use RSpec things with do ends where it expects curly braces or vice versa, you get odd behavior. And yeah, the thing is, what happens here is this curly brace actually binds to the method closest to the left of it, whereas the do end is weaker than the juxtaposition argument parsing. So yes, they do the same thing, but they have different precedents. So that's the only difference. In practice, I think the only thing people do is they use do end for multi-line blocks, and they use curly braces for single line blocks. There's another convention that no one uses. That's pretty cool too. Happy to chat about that. Yeah, any questions? We good? Things make as much sense as they ought to, I guess. Thumbs up from Aaron.
I have learned that you can, I never knew that you could up cursor and edit multi-line blocks in IRB.
Oh, IRB just keeps getting better in ways that are
Is that a new thing?
Probably.
I feel like previously you would go through your history, like I would go through the history and read the lines
it's a total
over
pain
again.
in the ass, right? Yeah, so like what?
That's amazing.
Yeah, so this is whatever's on my OSX, so 2.7. But yeah, yes, and it has like syntax highlighting. It looks very pretty. That's all very fancy. It can handle nil.nil as false, but it's pretty good at other things. So I think Pry actually handles this okay. Like I don't think Pry like insta blows up. IRB is like, what are you doing? And just dies. Yeah, so blocks are interesting because blocks aren't quite closures. They do have access to the scope around them. So you can, look at variables from the outside scope and see them. They make their own scopes, so you can create variables and they won't show up outside. The thing that separates them from things like anonymous functions or closures is that they can't move around. Like you can't move their scope around, right? So if we go back to the example we had, right? If you call yield just calls the block where it lies, right? It doesn't put it into an anonymous function and call it or anything. It just takes this thing and calls it, right? Using Ruby magic. And so one of the interesting things about blocks are they don't create any complicated, complicated heap thing where you have to kind of keep track, like, because closures on the heap, right, are annoying, right? You have to take this, like, oh, here's the function, here's its environment, here's all the variables, and you have to stick them there. And if you move it around, you have to keep track of that, right? There's a lot of accounting to do. And that accounting costs memory and costs performance. And in Ruby, if you just call a block and call yield, it doesn't have to copy anything because it knows that this can't go anywhere. So it makes a scope, but the scope's just nested in the scope above it. It's not something that needs to be like placed on the heap and moved around from place to place. It's just where it is, it's static, it sits there, it just gets called, that's it. So Ruby blocks actually have quite a bit of different performance than things like anonymous functions in Ruby. So those are things like lambdas, which I guess I stuck in a hash key. Where is it? Yeah, so we stuck a lambda and a hash key, right? And then there's another thing called a proc, which is similar. And those are anonymous functions. And those can be moved around, those can be put into variables, and those can be copied around. So they take up heap space. Did you raise your hand, Dimas, or no? No, okay. I just saw motion.
I scratched my head.
Okay, that's appropriate, I think. Yeah, and I think honestly, the only other thing I actually had prepared to talk about with Ruby is exceptions. Ruby has a pretty sophisticated exception handling facility. I know Aaron is currently being burned by the fact that it's, you know, somewhat willy-nilly, Wild West, hard to figure out. In particular, that of the psych library, which is Demos also participated in the discussion of. So yeah, I mean, the problem with exceptions are the problem with exceptions everywhere, which is it's hard to tell where they came from. It's hard to tell what they can throw. And Ruby has a whole bunch of built-in ones. So there's the exception class up top. Oh, come on. Oh, whoops. Oh, I used to have a cursor that I could see and overlay, and now I can't. Whatever, I'll be okay. So yeah, there's this top level exception class, and then there's this, so the top level exception class is pretty weird. It has things like the no memory error. The no memory error is something that might happen if you run out of memory, right? Things, I don't know what a security error is. There's a signal exception, which presumably is caused by signals. And then there's something called standard error. And standard error is most of where the normal stuff happens. So the classic is, I guess, yeah, there's like zero division error, local jump error, which is a fun one, argument error if you pass arguments that are wrong to something. So you can see that a lot of these things, like a lot of these errors almost feel like they came from a world where there's no static typing. So like something like argument error doesn't even make sense to something with static typing. But it makes sense in Ruby if you just call a method with the wrong arguments, since it's all evaluated at runtime. And yeah, so I mean, exceptions in Ruby are objects. Like they have methods, you can add methods to them, you can add data to them. I haven't really played with, I don't know that much about Python exceptions. I don't know that much. Java has like something like uncaught and caught exceptions. I don't know what those are. I don't know what that means. Like unhandled or handled, right?
There's a checked and unchecked, and those have to do with the type system. So a checked exception is compiler enforced. It must either be caught or forwarded, whereas an unchecked exception needs to, like, like the type system isn't aware of it. Those are only caught and thrown and known about at runtime. The compiler doesn't care about their existence.
So Ruby, I guess, only has unchecked exceptions in the Java parlance. Like there's no compiler checking for exception catching. Right, and the words in Ruby are rescue, and I guess there's also ensure. Ensure means do this no matter what happens, right? Even if an exception gets thrown. And so yeah, I was surprised to find out that exceptions were kind of like part of the original Ruby version. Maybe not quite this hierarchy, but something pretty similar. And you'll definitely see them a lot in Ruby programming, especially in things like Rails, where you're running a web server and you don't want to, have the web server throw an exception out into the user. But you'll see exception classes floating around, and you might have to do things with them. This hierarchy also says why it's probably not a good idea to rescue exception, because if you rescue the exception class, you're rescuing things like syntax error or no memory error or whatever fatal does. And those things probably you don't really have a recovery strategy for. There are times when it makes sense to have those for sure. Anyone who says you should never do it is, I think, wrong, but for the most part, you shouldn't. It's better to kind of focus. And if you want specific types of errors, you should make classes and catch those. So this is kind of the usage of class hierarchy in Ruby that's pretty important to understand, for better or worse. Yeah, and then I only have one more slide, and it just has the word Rails on it. Because like, I don't know, I don't want to make a talk about Rails. Like we all use Rails. Like everyone knows what Rails is. Rails is basically the reason I have this talk at all, is because Ruby was esoteric and then became a lot less esoteric when Rails came out. And yeah, I mean, I could probably give like, everyone gives talks on Rails, this and that, and what kind of active record this and action pack that or whatever. But suffice to say that I think it's also interesting that, I mean, if we want to talk about the language Ruby and the framework Rails, there's a lot of stuff from Rails that gets like backported into Ruby itself. There are methods that kind of change like very sophisticated, almost like hash methods and things that I think started as Rails add-ons in active support and then became parts of the core language. And I think a lot of the craziness around dates and times and a thing called date time in Ruby kind of got simplified into a single piece. What's up, Brian?
Do you want to, I don't know if you have more slides beyond this. Do you want to talk about metaprogramming stuff a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we can kind of talk about that a bit. I feel like that kind of ties into the dynamic dispatch thing, right? It's sort of like dynamic dispatch with a flair. So I guess I think the metaprogramming thing that everyone thinks of is maybe method missing is a good example. Also, I guess there's things like define method, which is an example of metaprogramming, right? Right, so I can, you know, I can take a list of strings, right, and I can, right, I can make a method with string names, right, and I can say, you know, puts method called. Right, and so, whoops. Yeah, and so now I get like, I get, whoops. Oh, it's B comma. Oh God. Let's see if we can even call that. Okay. I don't think you could call it without.
You need the colon in front of the string literal in send.
Do I mean, in send worked.
Yeah,
Oh,
looks like it worked, yeah.
Oh,
The
my
problem
bad.
is you can't like call it with any like normal syntax. I think the other, yeah, like if you do, there's other weird things you can, like I think you could put like space characters in there and stuff. Yeah, so define method is a good example of, I think, like somewhat reasonable metaprogramming where you want to, you know, you have similar methods and you want to kind of define them to be based on what they're called or some data object or something like that. I haven't used method missing in a really long time. Maybe, I don't know, there's like probably a good thing online, right, that talks about it. Rails was kind of infamous for using it for its like helper and finder methods. So there were things like, you know, user dot find by email. Right, and these methods were actually made by method missing trickery and database columns based on active record. I think method missing is usually, I haven't seen a good usage of it outside of Rails in a long time. Brian Kelly, is this a reasonable discussion of metaprogramming?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example. I think that also the metaprogramming stuff is what makes Ruby really good for like DSLs. If you want to make custom DSLs for stuff, you can make your own little syntax for stuff and easily turn those into objects or methods.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's actually interesting because what is it? What is it? Maybe I'll just do. Oh, I see. I got a syntax error from the stupid B thing I did. Self.ancestors. Oh, weird. If I do, self.class.ancestors. There we go. Yeah, so there's some weird metaprogramming stuff and fun stuff you can do. Because if you look at what is it, object.methods, right? So this is like almost every object in Ruby has these methods. And there's a lot of them, and they're tainted, untaint, class exec, remove method. There's all these things, right? And if you look up the hierarchy, there's this thing called kernel. That's this module that gives you all these things like puts and other things like that. But then there's this thing called basic object, and basic object is kind of like a template that doesn't really have very many methods. Oh, wait, that's the same amount. Never mind. Do I have to do like .new methods? No, all right, never mind. I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. Am I confused? I guess I'm confused. That's all right. If I'm not confused, then I did it wrong. But yeah, you can actually hook into, I thought, oh, whatever. We'll just Google stuff, right? Googling solves everything. Basic objects, basic object Ruby. Yeah, okay, so this is the methods that I wanted to see. So basic object has almost no defined methods. And what this means is if you want to make methods that might interfere with object methods, say you want to make a DSL that uses like methods inside this, like you want to make some object. Oh, that's weird. Okay, so you want to make an object that has a method called send or a method called freeze. I don't know why you do that. That's confusing. You can use something like basic object, and basic object has almost no like defined methods on it. So it's a good template for like wacky DSL stuff. And I mean, I think the most obvious DSL that anyone uses is probably something like RSpec. If you've ever written RSpec, it's like this whole other language that doesn't really feel like anything. It's valid Ruby syntax, but it's an entirely defined DSL for writing tests. And so I think the best example of a DSL in Ruby is surely something like RSpec, which I think almost everyone has familiarity with. That being said, I think RSpec is actually pretty hard to learn. It's very complicated. It has a lot of moving parts. Brian?
Yeah, to like add to that confusion and maybe like, because I see Demos chuckling so much coming from a Java world. Like I went from Java world to Ruby world, and it was like really disconcerting. Like when I talked about like the floor is lava, like it's just like you're doing all this stuff and you don't know where any of it is coming from, and it's all magical, and it's like great that you can accomplish so much stuff, but it's like a little unsettling that you're just like, great, I have this method, I don't know why I have it and where it comes from, but I can use it, which can also kind of lead to confusions of like, oh, maybe I'm somewhere where I can use that method. Oh no, it's not available, and I don't know why. Especially in like the Rails and RSpec world.
Oh yeah. So like Rails isn't really a DSL. Rails is just like a lot of methods that come from a lot of weird places. And I think RSpec is like very much on the overboard in terms of DSL-ness. And then I think Ruby, like the things like blocks and like all these alternate ways of doing things, I think really can be confusing. So like an example of like an alternate way of doing something, right, is something like 1, 2, 3 dot map, and then, or let's use the example from before. So A, B, C, and then instead you can pass a symbol and then give it an ampersand and say upcase, right? And this, this does the same thing as the code did before, but it's a very bizarre syntax, right? And then of course there's all these like Rubocop just yells at you because it wants you to do stuff like this, which is another weird syntax. And then if you want to make an array of symbols instead of doing something normal like this, you can do, what is it, %i, right? So I think Ruby has a lot of bits and a lot of things and a lot of, I don't want to say it's trickery, but there's a lot to learn. What's up, Brian?
When you use those, like the %w just means everything in here is expected to be a word and spaces are the delimiters. But like once you learn that, like it's a whole lot less typing and a little bit clearer. And then if you're awesome and using something like RubyMine, it will just fix all those things for you and make some very like terse but clear syntax.
Yeah, I like this syntax too. It's nice, but I think it's just like it's more syntax for a newbie to kind of overcome. And it's something that I don't really think exists in many other languages, right? And so things like, this, or like the weird one that I always think that's interesting is, so reduce has that too, right? You can do, right? And you still get like, you can reduce with the plus operator. But reduce also can take just a symbol, which is weird. And so the reason Dimas is shaking his head, the reason is because reduce can just send this plus to the first element and call the second, and then take the accumulator and keep just calling send. And map isn't actually calling send here. It's actually, this is a way of making a anonymous function that calls upcase on its argument. So it gets weird. And then there's a lot of pieces, and I don't know, I can understand why people find it sort of overwhelming. And then couple that with the fact that it doesn't really have a type system. People can dynamically make methods, they can dynamically make classes, they can dynamically call classes and methods. I think it's a language that once you have a large code base, if some things weren't done quite right, you're going to be in trouble. And it can be very hard to refactor or change things because there's so much dynamicism that people might have used in inappropriate places, or they thought were appropriate places that really aren't anymore. So what's up, Eric?
I wonder if anyone has any like context on like how this happened, how like Ruby has this reputation for doing multiple things different ways, and like how it got to the point where like RuboCop needed to evolve to like, unify syntax. Like how have other languages avoided this problem or problem feature, whatever word you want to use?
I'll say that if I remember correctly, like Ruby, I think you said this, Lindsay, Ruby and Python both had Perl as an influence, and Perl was definitely of the opinion that you can do as like a scripting language that was meant to sort of oftentimes be used for like systems programming, and like as a better better than shell scripting, sort of a combination of scripting and programming. I think that being able to do things in a bunch of different ways was a key feature of Perl, and I get the sense that other languages that came after that, which include Ruby and Python, although I don't know Python that well, they also were considered scripting languages and inherited some of that philosophy. And for better or worse, I'm not totally sure.
I think like if you look at the names of some of the methods, it's pretty clear that like, so Smalltalk, there's like, so in Smalltalk, map is called collect, and reduce is called inject, and I think find is called detect. And so I think the idea was they were kind of trying to get people over from a Smalltalk heritage and from other languages. So like Lisp uses collect, Lisp uses reduce, Lisp uses, I think it uses find. I don't actually know. I haven't like written Lisp in a very long time. And so it's almost like, I think it's like such an intersection of languages that they kind of wanted to make sure no one really did anything wrong. Yeah, but the problem with that, right, is now it's like, well, everyone is writing the same language, and Ruby is, I think, quite a bit more popular than Smalltalk. I'm not going to say anything about the popularity of Perl because I don't know. I think it's died quite a bit in the last 10 to 15 years, but and so yeah, I think it's just interesting to me because Python is very much the opposite. Python seems to pride itself on only one way to do things, which I don't think is actually true, but is way more true than it is in Ruby.
It also kind of makes sense for, I don't think that Perl was super popular and isn't now, but it was never meant to be used by large teams on large code bases. And I don't think Ruby, I'm guessing on this, but I don't think Ruby was necessarily intended to be as popular in the way that it is right now. Rails obviously supercharged Ruby, and now you have huge code bases and huge teams, and all of a sudden the ability to do a bunch of things in different ways is bad. But when you're a one-person or a two-person team building something small, that's actually really good. You get to, it just works more quickly, and it makes intuitive sense to more people who might think differently than other people. But you know, it's like then over time it becomes a con instead of a pro.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's weird because Ruby uses something like object orientation, right? And object orientation is something that I think is very effective at organizing larger code bases, right? And so I feel like it's interesting that they have this dynamicism and this Perlness tied up with this small talk OO thing. And I find OO to be a very effective way of organizing large code. But yeah, it has so much dynamicism and it's like, it's actually kind of a double-edged sword. It's also weird, like Eric just talking about, like Ruby doesn't really have a standard. It's actively defeated getting a standard for its entire life. There's actually this whole like Rubinius thing that happened, I think like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. And Rubinius was supposed to be a new implementation of Ruby that basically had like a core C implementation, and then had the rest of the language defined in this like mini core Ruby. And I think the controller of the Rubinius project tried to begin a standardization process or a spec writing process for Ruby. And I think the Ruby community at large actually took that as a way for him to like control the direction of Ruby and to kind of restrict how it would grow. And they actually actively rejected it. And it's kind of,
I said, now he writes Go. Evan,
oh yeah,
that was the guy that founded Ruby.
oh yeah. Well, yeah, and there's actually like, there's a lot of stuff in the Ruby mailing list about him trying to get, I don't know if it's that person, but it's someone involved in Rubinius, trying to get Ruby standardization to happen. And the Japanese like core Ruby team was like, no, we don't want that. We want to make a language that we like, and we don't want to have to deal with standards and specs and stuff. And so it's a language that, yeah, it's like the parser is crazy. If you tried to write down everything in Ruby, it's crazy. It's a big language, and it's you know, the implementation is the spec in a way, versus, you know, something, yeah, like Python, which certainly has a write downable spec, and something like Go, which has a spec that's like a novella or something, not very big. So yeah, any other what's it's about, you know, Ruby stuffs?
You didn't talk about JRuby. Everybody's favorite.
No. JRuby does anyone use JRuby? I don't, like, I've never used JRuby, so I don't know.
I've tried using JRuby. It's hard.
Is it still a thing?
We managed to get a enterprise company to use Rails by using JRuby, because JRuby was Java and they would only do Java, and that got us to do Rails. So if you ever trying to get Ruby into a Java shop.
Yeah, I had a friend who wanted to use JRuby for Rails so that they could sneak Clojure in. Let's see. I mean,
there was something about, so JRuby was always slow, and there was a lot of work being done by, who's the main guy?
I forget now. I just had his
I saw talking. There was a lot of work being done by the main dude to try and speed it up. And there was something about this JVM call called like invoke dynamic or something that was basically supposed to magically, this was many years ago, supposed to magically make all the method missing stuff in JRuby fast instead of extremely slow. And I don't think it actually worked, because nobody ever talks about JRuby, but I was super interested in JRuby for exactly the reason BK said, is that I would run into places that had a huge JVM infrastructure and were theoretically open to any language that ran on top of the JVM. And so I was like, oh, I can get Ruby in there, but it never, like I could never get like an existing code base, an MRI code base to work. There was gems that didn't exist in the Java ecosystem, and just everything.
yeah, I mean, here's the Ruby build kite, and there's no JRuby here. There's Ruby 2.7 and there's Ruby 3, and then there's a Ruby like master build. So seems like, I don't know.
Its own project. I think JRuby's its own project.
Aaron,
well, I'm saying that like if Rails cared about it, it would be
yeah.
testing against JRuby, and it doesn't. So I don't know how much, like if you wanted JRuby, I can't imagine anything but the ability to run Rails as the motivation. So I don't think you want to write Ruby shell scripts and use JRuby or something like that. So yeah, any other?
I would promote like Ruby community, Ruby documentation. Like in the Ruby world, like I always encounter just like lots of awesome little projects, lots of friendliness, but also documentation that just got you up and running. Like especially compared coming from like the Java world, where it was just like, well, we've got this abstract class that you can like implement, and there's an interface that you can, and blah blah blah, and you're just like, just show me what, show me a simple example of what to do. And I've always found that great about the Ruby community and their documentation. It's like, here's how you install it, here's how you do some stuff with it, here's the API,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, it has a lot of documentation that's like how to do stuff instead of just like API definitions of like objects and classes, which isn't really helpful if you don't know what's going on. It's also funny, I worked with,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I worked with somebody who was actually coming from Java too, and they were amazed that like, I mean, this is kind of true of any open source language, but the fact that you could just look at the source code on your computer of the Ruby library and see what it's doing was kind of a big deal for certain people. I mean, I think we kind of take that for granted because we write a lot of Python or JavaScript or whatever, and these things, you can look at them all you want. But coming from Java, where you get, what is the thing? I don't even know what the jar? Yeah, jar. That's a thing, right? Jar.
Jar war.
Yeah. You get like a like opaque blob of crap, and you have no idea what the source code looks like inside it. Versus Ruby, which is, it's an interpreted language. You just get the code.
I'm more
look at it. So.
Aware of it now.
Well, there was one thing that Java pioneered that may be lost, but the Maven infrastructure, it allowed you to also download sources and be able to see the source code of the dependencies that you're working with.
If that person made it available. Another big difference between the communities is a lot of Java, from at least back in the day, a lot of Java projects were just closed source, and you would just get the jar, and it seemed like their tendency is like, we want to sell you this thing and you can buy it. Whereas in like the Ruby world, everything is open source. And to also add to a little bit of what Lindsay said and sort of the open source community thing, it's very easy also to, like, if you're using a bunch of dependencies, you can just bundle open a particular dependency, if you're having a problem, be able to debug it and like submit your own patch. Like that seems to be, I don't know if other people agree, but I feel like that sort of like open sourcing thing and people forking stuff and submitting patches like really came strongly from like the Ruby community.
For sure. Yeah.
And you don't have to get yelled at by Linus.
The other thing that Ruby did was that all of its culture influenced like all the other languages and frameworks after it, which
definitely. Like Rails is like, my friend, I remember I had a coworker in my last job, or my first job, who said Rails isn't a library, it's a pattern. It's almost like a way to write web apps. And I think things like Ruby gems, but then things like Bundler, that was like miles ahead of any other dependency management system that I had ever used up to that point. And I think things like Python still struggle with dependency management in a way that, like, I feel like Bundler has resolved in the Ruby community a long time ago. And then you have like, you have more sophisticated things like Cargo for Rust and other things like that. But I think they were heavily influenced by how easy it was to have project scope dependencies in something like Bundler.
And if Rails is just a pattern, I would also say that Rails is the best reference implementation of that pattern. You see so many other projects basically trying to catch up with what Rails has done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the first Rails project I've been on since I've been at C5. I've never been on one yet. And I've been here for 3.5 years, and it's like, I don't know. Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, these things. Like it's, I don't know. For me, it's very much coming home and, independent of like DHH's wackiness as a boss. He said a lot of things about Ruby and Rails that I think really jived with how I always thought about it, which is it's my first programming language love. Rails taught me how to write web programs, and I don't know, it's close to the heart for me. So do you want to talk more, Brian, or is your hand up incidentally?
Sorry, it's down.
Okay. All right. I guess we're after time, which is good because I was worried it wouldn't take the whole time. So
great presentation. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.